In the 1950s, the behavior of a hungry Japanese macaw on Koshima Island set off a flurry of discussion regarding whether and how animals learn from each other and whether animals can be said to have culture. The hungry macaw was a young female named Imo, who had started to wash the sweet potatoes that researchers were placing on her beach. The food on the beach would become covered with sand, and wading out into the water and washing off the potatoes likely allowed for a more easily consumed treat and potentially a desirable salty flavoring. Researchers soon observed that other macaws in the troop were washing their potatoes too, and Imo's actions were interpreted as an innovation that was imitated by others in her group. In the subsequent years, various other interpretations were made. Some researchers suggested the spread of the behavior could be the result of individual, asocial learning, instead of individuals imitating each other. For example, Visselbergi and Fragassi in 1990 provided captive tufted capuchins with sandy fruit and a tub of water. Many of the monkeys started to wash their fruit within hours, but there was no evidence of imitation. Others pointed out that imitation is only one form of social learning, and perhaps other mechanisms could account for the washing behavior, e.g., encountering wet potatoes left by others could create conditions that enhanced individual learning. Researchers may never be certain what caused the sweet potato washing behavior among the Japanese macaws, but there has been much learned about social learning in the subsequent years. Chapter Plan. This chapter will examine how animals and humans learn from conspecifics, what is commonly referred to as social learning. Attention will first be paid to theories regarding the evolution of social learning and the mechanisms by which one can learn from others. Then, social learning in four contexts will be examined: food and mate preferences, communication systems, and object use. Finally, the larger question of whether animals can be said to have culture will be explored, continuing a theme that will carry throughout the chapter regarding whether human social learning has species-unique qualities. Evolution and selectivity of social learning. Learning can occur through an individual's own asocial experiences with the world, e.g. through operant conditioning, or through observation of others' actions. Both asocial and social learning have been described as forms of phenotypic plasticity. They allow animals to change behavior to fit changing environments. There are important differences between these two learning processes, though. Individual learning is not passed on from generation to generation. The learning mechanisms may be inherited genetically, but the learning occurs through an individual's own interaction with the environment. In contrast, behaviors learned through social learning can be spread from one generation to another. In fact, it is typically assumed that social learning can be more efficient than individual learning because learning from others serves as a shortcut relative to iterations of trial and error learning. Still, individual learning may be necessary to provide an innovative behavior that others can observe and learn about. Also, in some situations, individual learning may be a preferred strategy over social learning. For example, nine-spined sticklebacks tend to ignore social information about the value of food patches when their own personal experience has provided up-to-date information. However, these same fish will switch to learning about food patches from others' behavior if their own individual information is unreliable. That is, when one's own information is trustworthy, it is not beneficial to learn potentially inaccurate information from others, yet in some instances, information provided by others may be better than one's own outdated information. Thus, the reliance on social versus individual learning depends on the relative costs and benefits of each. Many researchers have suggested that indiscriminately engaging in social learning is not adaptive, and instead predict that animals will be selective in terms of when to rely on social learning and whom to learn from. By these accounts, natural selection in animals capable of social learning should favor strategies that allow for discriminate learning. Importantly, these accounts are not suggesting that animals are aware of the strategies or understand why the strategy works. Two proposed strategies will be detailed below: being discriminative about when to learn from others and being discriminative about who to learn from. When to engage in social learning. Leyland proposed 3 when strategies that describe the circumstances in which individuals may start to learn from others' behavior. The first of these strategies is relatively simple. If one's established behavior becomes unproductive, switch to copy the behavior of others. This strategy characterizes the behavior of pigeons in a study by Lefebvre and Palomata, 1988, in which birds pecked at a carton to obtain seeds. Pigeons took food from other birds that were opening the cartons unless the scrounging behavior led to too little food, which occurred when there were too few birds opening boxes. Unproductive scroungers then began to open the cartons in a similar manner to other birds. Importantly, the researchers had previously demonstrated that the carton opening behavior was acquired by social learning. Scroungers apparently learned from others to open the boxes when scrounging proved to be unproductive. A second strategy is to engage in social learning when the costs of asocial learning are high, an idea described in great detail by Boyd and Richardson, 1988. Support for this strategy comes from the behavior of the nine-spined spickleback fish mentioned above. These fish will engage in social learning about food patches, but the closely related three-spined stickleback does not tend to use information gained from others' choice of food patch. Coulin and colleagues propose that individually learning about food patches is more costly for the nine-spined sticklebacks than the three-spined species, because the former has weaker defenses. The three-spined sticklebacks have larger spines than the nine-spined fish, as well as armored body plates. For the weaker nine-spined species, asocial personal sampling of food patches may be relatively costly and outweighed by the benefits of feeding, where others were observed to feed successfully. Lastly, social learning should occur more when the potential demonstrators share the same environment as the potential learner. The logic is thus: it is better to learn from another individual who has learned behavior that is effective in the same environment as one is currently in. If the environment rapidly changes, asocial learning may be favored. Some evidence of this strategy comes from rats in a study by Galef and Wiskin, 2004. Rats who were maintained in a frequently changing environment copied the food preferences of other rats less often than those living in a more stable environment. Whom to learn from? In 1995, Cusi-Corbel and Fragazzi proposed that in some cases of social learning, the identity of the demonstrator increases his or her salience for an observing individual. The authors called this directed social learning, separating it from instances of non-specific social learning, in which any one individual's behavior could influence many other individuals. The difference between these two instances of social learning, they argued, is not in terms of the type of information being learned or even the underlying cognitive processes. Instead, characteristics of the demonstrator in relation to the observer make the former's actions more likely to be salient to the latter. Directed social learning. The effectiveness of learning from others will depend to some extent on whether the individual who is being observed is actually successful and productive. Thus, an obvious strategy to use when deciding which individuals to learn from would be to focus on individuals who have cues to being successful. One cue, for example, might be that an individual has obtained food. Wilkinson, 1992, found that in a colony of bats, previously unsuccessful females would follow previously successful females as they left the colony to forage. Other cues to being successful may include one's status in the social hierarchy in general, with high-status individuals being copied more than low-status individuals. Relatedly, Heinrich and Gil White, 2001, have proposed that there may be a preference to learn from whomever others are learning from, a prestige bias, that in turn makes skilled individuals highly valued and perhaps highly ranked in a group. 3- and 4-year-old human children, for example, more frequently copied the tool use actions of an adult demonstrator who had previously been attended to by others than the actions of an adult who was ignored. Interestingly, this directed social learning was specific to the actions observed. The food preferences of prestigious tool-using models were not copied. Another proposed strategy when engaging in directed social learning is to do what the majority of individuals are doing, sometimes described as conformity. In guppies, rats, and pigeons, for example, there is evidence that the probability of copying a behavior increases in relation to the proportion of other individuals doing the behavior. This is only weak evidence of conformity, however, as other strategies may better describe these instances of social learning. Research by Hahn and colleagues, however, suggests that chimpanzees and human children are more likely to copy an action performed by 3 individuals than the action of one individual who repeats himself 3 times. Participants watched 3 different conspecifics put a ball into the same box to receive a reward, and also watched one conspecific put a ball into a different box for a reward 3 times. Figure 13.1. The chimpanzees and human children copied the box choice of both the single individual and that of the group of 3, the majority, but the box used by the majority was copied more often. This work is preliminary, however, as the authors warn that an alternative strategy may be at work. An observer may simply be choosing one individual at random to copy, and it is statistically more likely that this individual would be in the group than in the single model. Figure 13.1, Procedure for Study of Conformity by Hahn et al., 2012. Chimpanzees observed 3 different chimpanzees drop a ball into the same box to receive a reward, and also watched one chimpanzee place a ball into a different box for a reward 3 times. The evolution and selectivity of social learning is currently under study, and the major questions are still being answered. Indeed, most research in social learning has focused on what types of social learning animals engage in, not the context under which social learning occurs. What is clear for now is that social learning is not necessarily better than asocial learning. Reliance on one or the other depends on their relative costs and benefits. It is likely that animals and humans are discriminative in terms of when to engage in social learning, as well as selective in relation to who to copy. Types of social learning. Until now, this chapter has been using the word copying to broadly refer to an animal engaging in behavior that matches the behavior of other individuals. In reality, the corpus of social learning research, particularly research that has focused on the cognitive mechanisms underlying social learning, uses a vast number of terms. Some have even characterized the number of terms, and their often overlapping meanings, as bewildering. The cause of this abundance of terminology is actually good scientific practice. Experimentalists and theoreticians aim to carefully characterize and distinguish among the processes that drive social learning. In this section, the goal is to present the most contemporary distinctions. Figure 13.2 serves to summarize the distinctions between these terms using the example of chimpanzee termite fishing discussed in Chapter 8. Figure 13.2. Distinctions among the types of social learning discussed in this chapter. Here, the example of one chimpanzee observing another chimpanzee engage in termite fishing is used to illustrate the social learning processes. Type of social learning. Enhancement. The attention of an observing chimpanzee is drawn to the termite mound or the fishing stick. Subsequently, the chimpanzee may independently learn that engaging in certain activities with the stick at the mound leads to food. Observational conditioning. Hearing the food barks of a chimpanzee at a termite mound causes an observing chimpanzee to engage in food barking. Subsequently, the mound is associated with food. Types of emulation. Affordance learning. An observing chimpanzee learns that a stick can push through a termite mound and/or that termites will attach to the stick. Object movement reenactment. An observing chimpanzee learns how a stick can be moved to obtain food, though may not subsequently move its hand in the same manner as the other chimpanzee. End state emulation. An observing chimpanzee learns that termites can be retrieved and subsequently acts to achieve this by any means. End of emulation types. Mimicry. An observing chimpanzee learns the motions but not the purpose of the other chimpanzee's actions, and thus may subsequently poke sticks into other piles of earth, etc. Imitation. An observing chimpanzee recognizes the end state of the actions to obtain termites and uses the same actions as the observed chimpanzee. Enhancement. At the beginning of Chapter 1, the bottle opening behavior of blue tits was described. These birds quickly came to open the milk bottles delivered to houses in Great Britain in order to drink the cream off of the top. Because the behavior occurred in only a few isolated areas, Hind and Fisher, 1951, proposed that the behavior was being spread socially, but they also pointed out that it may have been the products of others' behavior that were actually the salient aspects to the observing birds, that is, Pecking at a food source comes naturally to many bird species, but it was the direction of this behavior onto the bottles that was learned. When this was tested directly in the lab with another bird species, black-capped chickadees, the product of others' actions, i.e. opened tubs, was enough to lead to increased opening of sealed containers by naive birds. Learning can thus be facilitated by having one's attention drawn to a locale or stimulus, a process called local enhancement or stimulus enhancement. Locales, places, and stimuli, e.g. a particular object that is being acted on, can be indistinguishable, but are not always the same, so the two processes are often considered separately. An example of stimulus enhancement comes from a study by Zental and Levine, 1972, in which rats watched another rat press a lever for water. The observing rats learned to press their own levers for water faster than rats that had observed another rat receiving water without pressing a lever. It is likely that the demonstrator's activity at its own lever gained the attention of the observers, and stimulus generalization may have occurred between the two levers. A natural question to ask is whether stimulus and local enhancement should be considered a type of social learning per se. It typically is, because in these situations it is the other individuals in the group who are creating the conditions for learning. Yet, after an individual is drawn to an enhanced stimulus or location, individual trial and error learning is likely taking place. As will be seen below, claims regarding the presence of imitation, another type of social learning, are often pitted against lower level, and thus presumably more parsimonious, explanations based on enhancement. Observational conditioning. When observing the actions of a conspecific, attention may be drawn to the location or an object, e.g. a lever, but also an association might be formed between that location or object and reinforcement, e.g. presentation of food. This higher-order conditioning, the observer does not personally experience the unconditioned stimulus, is typically called observational conditioning. It is also possible for the affective state that is aroused in an observer from seeing the affective state of a demonstrator via, for example, emotional contagion, to itself be associated with whatever stimulus is present. Learning to recognize predators, for example, is an example of observational conditioning. In many small birds, the response to a predator is to engage in mobbing behavior. Birds in a group approach the predator while calling in a particular manner. Naive birds, however, must learn about predators from others in their group, and a study by Curio et al. 1978 suggests that observational conditioning is a likely mechanism. In that study, a demonstrating European blackbird and an observer blackbird were in two separate cages, such that the observer could not see what the demonstrator could see. The demonstrator, a bird who had already learned to recognize predators, was presented with a stuffed version of a common predator and began to engage in species-typical mobbing behavior. The observer could see and hear this mobbing, and through contagion began to engage in mobbing behavior as well. However, in front of the observer was a non-predator, another type of bird, or even a bottle of the same size. The observer, when presented later with the harmless bird or bottle, engaged in mobbing behavior. It appears that the demonstrator's mobbing behavior elicited mobbing behavior in the observer, and the observer learned an association between this behavior and the non-predator object. Also see box 13.1. Shuttleworth 2010 points out that this learning can even occur after the observer has been habituated to the safe object, suggesting that latent inhibition may not be strong in this situation. Box 13.1, Social Influence. In 1964, Tolman noted that a satiated chicken will start to eat again if it is introduced to a hungry chicken that begins to eat. Humans and some other animals will often yawn soon after observing a yawn. Some bird species engage in anti-predator mobbing behavior upon seeing others doing this behavior. Contagion is a term used to describe these reflexive, species-typical responses to the behavior of others. This behavior is considered to be unlearned. It is a behavior that is released by the behavior of others. Contagious behaviors are social in the sense that the behavior of others influences an individual's behavior, but they are not considered a type of social learning. That said, an individual animal may learn to associate its current socially elicited behavior and emotional state, e.g., the behaviors and arousal elicited by observing a conspecific, engage in anti-predator behavior, with the stimulus in the environment. Thus, contagion may sometimes be a first step on the way to social learning. Other social influence factors may affect the behavior of an individual, and one of the most studied examples is that of social facilitation, also called social enhancement. Sometimes, the mere presence of a conspecific can increase or decrease an individual's arousal, regardless of the conspecific's behavior. Changes in arousal, in turn, can affect an individual's task performance, exploratory behavior, fear, and other behaviors. Zhejiang, 1965. In general, if a task is very easy or well learned, e.g., a relatively easy maze for which an individual has previous experience, the presence of others who are either watching or also engaged in the task seems to enhance the individual's performance. In contrast, the presence of others seems to decrease performance on difficult tasks. Zhejiang, 1965, proposed that social facilitation effects were due to an activation of the endocrine system and elevation of cortisol levels that occurred when others were present, but even today the mechanisms underlying social facilitation are not well known. Some researchers have noted that when examining social learning, social facilitation effects can be controlled for by including a condition in which observers are in the presence of a conspecific, yet this conspecific does not perform the target behavior. By doing so, the experimental and control groups both presumably experience similar levels of social facilitation. Another example of the social transmission of predator learning via observational conditioning comes from the manner in which captive rhesus monkeys learn to fear snakes. Monkeys born in the laboratory do not express a fear of snakes, though in the wild, the same species will react with a strong fear response, including vocalization and withdrawing. If laboratory monkeys are shown a video of wild monkeys responding to a snake, they too engage in the fear behaviors. This also occurs later when the videotaped monkey is no longer present, yet a snake is near. Importantly, observational conditioning that allows for the social transmission of predator recognition also appears to be selective. In a follow-up experiment, Cook and Manika, 1990, found that observers did not learn to fear flowers after seeing video events that had been edited to show a conspecific reacting in fear to flowers. Subsequent work with human infants, who also do not naturally show a fear of snakes, has found that infants pay more attention to images of snakes if these images are paired with fearful adult voices, but this does not occur with other types of images.